All right there, class. Here we go. We're going to be talking about proportion and movement, two more of the 8 principles of composition. These two have some overlap. I think you'll find as you do this class, the longer you do it, you're going to see a lot of overlap with all of the things that we've discussed previously. In fact, some slides that we've used before would definitely apply to these two concepts in terms of being a good example. We'll start with proportion, also sometimes referred to as scale, although I think proportion is more accurate. I think scale is sort of like a descriptor of proportion. So this refers to the size relationships between elements, ensuring visual harmony and proper sizing within an artwork. As a key principle, it dictates how parts relate to the whole. You can read all that right there while I just talk to you a little bit about what I personally think it is. Proportion actually has several different interpretations, almost like the word value has a lot of different interpretations. But proportion, it can be something that we use to understand the space that we're in. You're going to see how we can manipulate size of things to understand what is in the foreground, what's in the middle ground, and what's in the background. And then proportion can also refer to how something is measured against something near it, which things are proportionately larger or smaller. Proportion can also refer to how you measure something against itself. That's something that we're going to talk quite a bit about as well. A lot of times when people talk about proportions, they're actually referring to the human form. We talk, I'm sure a lot of you at some point in your life have been told what is proportionate about you. Maybe if you were shopping for clothes, you might be like, I'm more of a long-legged person, or I have a longer torso. Some people say that, I got a really thin neck or long arms, and they have to purchase clothes that reflect that, right? So all of our measurements that we use for like clothing, for example, are a reflection of our proportions. So we'll talk a bit about that more. But let's talk first about how proportion relates to how we perceive depth of field and distance and proximity. So this painting really demonstrates the proportions of the same subject matter. In the case of this painting, it's mostly that grass, that tall kind of wheatgrass look that we've got here. And in the foreground, you can see that the stalks of grass are more well rendered. They're also bigger. And then as we get further away, they become smaller and less rendered. So proportionately, or scale-wise, we can infer that the things in the bottom part of the composition are in the foreground of the image. Middle ground would be some of those hills that are sort of dead center in the horizontal. And then beyond that, we start to lose all sense of detail, and they're just very small, scaled down sections of color that we can understand as being the wheatgrass, even though we don't see the details of it much anymore. And that really tells the tale of like what the foreground, middle ground, and background are. By the way, these are very big subjects. I will say that by no means are we going to do an exhaustive, comprehensive study of all this stuff. These are more broad strokes kinds of things. So when you do your research and your digging, you may actually find some more terminology that goes beyond this, and that's great if you do. But for the sake of just kind of getting the fundamentals down, that's what we're going to focus on today. This one's even more direct. Those tall, I believe those might still be the same. They look similar to like the cypress trees of Van Gogh's Starry Night. But those trees, you can see that on the left, there's those two that are the largest, and those tell me proportionately that that hill is in the foreground, because we sort of intuitively understand that these trees are meant to be of a similar size. So when we make that leap in logic there, which isn't much of a leap at all, we can then infer that that the hill on the left is in the foreground. This here actually shows a lot of things. I'm going to pose the question to you here, and I'm not going to answer it. I'm just going to have you think for a second. It definitely shows proportion in the sense of the scale of the pillars and arches in the front, and the receding and diminishing scale of the ones as they go back off in the distance. But I want you to think to yourself, what other elements or principles does this show right now? Because it's showing a lot. Like I said earlier at the top, we're going to be starting to overlap a lot of concepts here. So I want you to start thinking that way, that, none of these slides are just one thing. In fact, in many cases, they are all of the things that we talked about. But if I'm cutting it short, good old Grover from Sesame Street will tell you, near and far are very well represented by just a large and small version of the same thing. Okay, so proportion also refers to the measure of part or parts of something against the whole, particularly focused on the body. Again, what I was talking about earlier, coming back here in the form of the Vitruvian Man. This symbolizes the ideal human body's perfect proportions. I actually do this little exercise when I have some of the younger grades that I teach as well, and actually have someone stand up in class and hold their arms out, and we use a yardstick, and we measure what that is, and then we find that is pretty much every time within an inch of their actual height. So you might even want to try that yourself if you feel like it. You can reach your arms out and have somebody measure it, and that should be roughly what your actual height is. It's not always the case. We do have people with different proportions, but frequently it is the case. So this was meant to be the human ideal, and it had a lot of combinations of science and religious belief in what Da Vinci was trying to do. He kind of had a foot in both of those areas. And so I really tend to focus on the square in that situation, because what it does is shows that measurement that I was talking about earlier. But it also is just a good example that you could refer to when we talk about other ways that we use to measure human proportion, like this right here. So in order to better understand proportion, it helps to measure the subject against itself. So imagine almost if you were an architect and you were looking at a building and you're trying to understand how tall it was without really having the measurements. You could look at it if it was perhaps like an apartment complex that had a series of the same repeating kind of windows over and over again from level to level. You could figure out what one of those windows actually was in terms of height, and then you can look at the building and see how many windows would it take to get from the bottom of the building to the top of the building. And in the same sense, that's what we're doing here. We look at the human body and we want to make sense of it, and it's not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of different body types, obviously. We're going to talk about that in a second too, but there's a lot of complexity to any life form. I think humans, we do have some very, if you really think about it, some unusual features to our body, which, are the reasons why we can do certain things like, using opposable thumbs to have the ability to grip and manipulate anything we want with our hands. But finding a nice, easy to grasp measurement is sometimes as simple as deciding that it's going to be the head. So if you take the exact height of the head, and it has to be really, really on point, you can usually measure someone and find out, if they're an adult, that they are typically around 8 heads tall. That is not always the case with everyone, and in fact, I think it's worth keeping the conversation going to talk about both male and female, because our proportions can vary radically just based on gender alone. And so sometimes some people will try to still associate a female height as 8 heads, with the argument being that perhaps their head size might be smaller than the male's. But that's not always true. And in fact, sometimes you might have someone with a very small head that's a male, and a woman with a larger size head. And if you were to try to apply the logic the same way, it would not work out. So when you look at the females here, the one in the middle is 7.5 heads tall. The one on the right is actually just 7 heads tall, and they still do make sense. So again, this will go back down to what type of person we're talking about. You've got heavier, thinner, taller, shorter people with different genetic makeup that might mean that proportionately to their body, their head might be larger than someone else's or smaller, and that unit of measurement then would change. But really the important thing to remember when you are trying to figure out proportions of someone's figure is that you're staying within their set of rules, right? So whoever that person is, whatever their body type is, you're only using that to measure them. You're measuring them against themselves. You're not measuring an 80-year-old man's body against a 21-year-old female's body. They just are not going to be the same thing for so many different reasons. Breaking it down even further, proportion really can get down to the microscopic level if you really wanted to. I mean, we could figure out the proportions of the pores of your nostril if you wanted to. But it's all about finding a unit of measurement within the form and measuring the form against it. So in this case, you can see that they're doing more than one type of measurement. We're doing eyes, nose, the whole head, the distance between the bottom of the nose and the chin. There's all these different ways to measure the metrics of this. One that I always go back to when trying to diagram a face is the fact that most of the time you can fit one eye length of eye between the actual two eyes that are there. And similarly, the ear height is typically also from the brow to the nose, with, of course, exceptions all over the place. Foreshortening is a perspective technique that distorts an object's proportions to create the illusion of 3D depth, making closer parts appear significantly larger than distant ones. If we all understand, from previous examples that all of these flat images are an illusion, these are not an actual person's arm reached out towards me, it's just a series of lines that creates this illusion. You can start to really understand how the illusion, can really be manipulated based on how far you're willing to go to manipulate it. A lot of drawing at more of a basic level tends to be flat and doesn't have the reach forward or backward that this does. And so this person here on the left did a really good job of trying to demonstrate for us how exactly the arm can be foreshortened by drawing lines on an actual human arm, and then isolating and identifying what happens to them when the hand comes towards us, and then rebuilding the arm on that. So that's really kind of a way to recreate reality in a manner that uses a lot of intelligent design. But that one on the right there is just a really nice example of extreme foreshortening, where something is so radically drawn to be coming toward or away from us that you kind of wonder, if it's done wrong, it looks pretty bad. It looks like the man would have a giant hand. But in this case, he doesn't have a giant hand. He has a hand reaching out to me. And if you were to actually just take the size of that shape, you could say that it might be bigger than the actual head of the individual, even though we know that in reality it's not. I thought these were fun. Sometimes now that you know the rules, you break them for effect. So the caricature artist is a classic example of this. Obviously, this person or people can draw really well, but what they're doing is also expressing something, whether it's humor or exaggerating the person's form for an effect that reflects who they are. I think of this is obviously Jack Black and Snoop Dogg, and with Jack Black, he's got kind of an impish, devilish kind of quality to him. So by spreading the eyes out way past that single eye length that we talked about, it kind of morphs him into more of an elfish kind of impish kind of creature, really exaggerating the mouth and tightening up the nose so it's it almost cinches in the face. These are all things that you do to overdo the existing features that are present. Similarly with Snoop Dogg there, he almost looks like a giraffe in this picture, but I also think that this is an incredibly well done piece because of what it says about him, what it's meant to suggest, kind of that that stare, that kind of almost like famous kind of heavily lidded eyes that he has there are made even more heavy and lidded in this picture. Proportion can also be a style. It can be something that we kind of create to unify an idea, to make it more individualized or one of a kind. Manga and anime are a very, very good example of this. You can always recognize what that style is once you see it, almost to the point where the artists themselves can be interchangeable or even not worth mentioning in a way, because they're all basically aping the same formula. I'm not saying that as a negative at all. I do think it's a very difficult thing to do well, and people have their own kind of takes on it. But the reality is that it's meant to instantly put you into a headspace where if you understand what manga is or anime, that you kind of know what you're getting yourself into, the kind of storytelling, the kind of themes and subject matters that might be there. They all kind of come through because of these exaggerated proportions, or where we have these very large eyes, very small nose and mouth, very infantile kind of head shape, and if you were to try to measure the whole body with heads, it would be a very different conversation than what we were doing before with an average human being. Down here, you can see like Despicable Me characters and how they've exaggerated those figures with great effect. And on the right bottom slide, that's actually from a movie from the early 2000s called The Triplets of Belleville, which did a lot of great stuff with body manipulation for effect, even down to this guy here. You can't really see it in the slide, but this is a guy who's in the Tour de France as a cyclist, and he has this incredibly kind of almost emaciated body, almost like an aerodynamic nose, and then these very ridiculously overdeveloped legs, because he just constantly spends his time cycling. And once you understand proportion, you can mess around with it for dramatic effect, for humorous effect. There's a bunch of fun ways to play with that. You can even argue that maybe like movies, like kaiju movies like Godzilla, are all about messing with proportion and scale, because you take a lizard creature and you turn him into something bigger than a skyscraper, and suddenly it changes the conversation, right? It becomes something very interesting. So to review here, proportion, which is sometimes referred to as scale, it refers to the size relationship between elements, ensuring visual harmony and proper sizing within artwork, or proper missizing. Maybe I'm making up a word there, but you get what I mean. The Vitruvian Man, the illustration by Leonardo da Vinci, which symbolizes the ideal human body's perfect proportions, that represents the Renaissance belief that humanity links the physical and the spiritual worlds. And then foreshortening, our perspective technique that distorts an object's proportions to create the illusion of 3D depth. Now, movement. Movement should be a little bit more straightforward, although there's some overlap in the terms, and I'll try to do my best to explain what the subtle differences are. So movement is a principle of composition that guides the viewer's eye through a piece. It creates a sense of energy, action, and dynamic flow using lines, shapes, and colors. It uses a lot of things, actually, not just that. Again, this is not completely comprehensive. This is more of a introduction. But we can break down movement into these 4 categories. I've heard people say more or even combine some of these. I'm going to keep it simple and just go with these 4. So implied movement, physical movement, rhythmic movement, and optical movement are the ones we're going to talk about. Optical movement is an illusion of movement created with the use of contrast, shapes, patterns, and colors. And it gives this feeling that is a pretty big illusion, sometimes almost like eye-crossingly so, that the image is actually moving when in fact it's not. It can almost be hypnotic optical movement. So there is a difference between that and one of the other ones that we're going to discuss. And it does come down to that actual feeling like it's moving because of the optical illusion almost that's being created there. Implied movement is when there's a suggestion of movement in a static image. So it's not a literal representation of movement, but it's a hint that makes the viewer imagine it. It's almost like something either has just happened or is about to happen. So in this case with these pictures, you can feel that there's movement there because it feels like the person in the sculptures is in the movement. So it almost feels like we're catching them after something happened or as something's about to happen. And the dramatic poses of the horsemen and the horses on the right all suggest that they're in motion. If they were just standing there still, with their legs firmly planted and everything straight and on the level, you would not be able to argue that there was movement there at all. Physical movement in art refers to artists using different art elements to create a sense of motion in a picture. It can create literal movement when lines such as zigzags or spirals are used to create an illusion of movement, an abstract movement. So I know that this can actually sometimes be very similar to implied movement. The difference here being the actual physical representation of the movement happening there. So we're going to talk about action lines, speed lines, all that good stuff. Even sound effects can help create this feeling of movement. But you can see there that the person with the little briefcase there has these lines behind him that are, kind of telling us that he's going from left or some right to left. The explosion of lines and that bam, as well as that actual action line of that punch that the girl's delivering to that guy's kidney. These are representations of physical movement. You can see it here, again, a lot of leading lines, a lot of speed lines. Those are words that we're going to talk about in a second, but I just want you to kind of observe them here and how well this is done. It really does, it's kind of a masterclass in visual communications and storytelling. We'll get back to that in a second. Rhythmic movement in art refers to a repeated or alternated pattern of shapes, colors, or lines that create a sense of flow in an artwork. So variation, which is something we've talked about before, alternation and repetition of visual elements helps to create this feeling of movement. And the difference here, again, is the idea that there's like a repeated pattern of shapes or color or whatnot. So here's Wassily Kandinsky's composition number 8. A lot of repeating geometric shapes, a lot of angles and directional choices. We've got The Dance by Henri Matisse, where there's the use of color as an element to help with this, to help us focus on what is moving, and this overlapping pattern of these nude figures moving around with variation that creates the feeling of the rhythmic movement that we're referring to. And of course, one that I've noticed a lot of people are using as examples, which is totally fine. Starry Night, the movement of the brush strokes in the sky to represent sort of clouds and stars and the moon, has also this feeling of movement that has a rhythmic quality to it. Getting back to the motion that we're talking about in comics, action lines, or sometimes called speed lines, sometimes even called motion lines as well. Good way to suggest movement. And when done well, they become a character of their own almost in the composition. They're also a nice way as a shortcut to not have to draw a bunch of stuff in the background that you don't want to draw. A lot of times, this is associated with comics. So you can see a bunch of examples here of how speed lines can be used for effect in a comic book. Now, in the case of leading lines, these are slightly different because these are not some sort of imaginary lines that we're seeing, almost like with the speed lines, it almost feels like a hallucination or, definitely something that's not tangible or physically there. With leading lines, it's actually just man-made or natural lines that are already existing in the environment that, when you use them to point in the right direction, they can point towards a specific subject. So in the one on the left, obviously they're pointing towards that windmill, and the one on the right, they're pointing towards the children there. And none of that is imaginary stuff. That's all real. They don't always have to be straight lines either. You can see the one on the left there has a lot of curves that are kind of pointing towards the momentum of this cyclist. And the woman jumping, it's almost like all the leading lines are pointing towards a spot near where she's going to land. So it's, again, this implication there using the actual surroundings. Line of sight in art is a very subtle way to actually create movement. It is It can be a narrative tool. It can establish perspective. It can just do a lot of different things. And it is effective even if, and sometimes specifically because no one is moving. Like in this piece, it does feel like the characters on the left and the right are moving, but their lines of sight being guided towards our central character really do bring the eye towards her, not just because she's in the middle and she's, not clothed and her eyes are kind of gazing out somewhat towards us. It's not just all that. It is the specific line of sight of the characters around her as well, in addition to. Breaking it down here, you can see how everyone who's looking at this child is creating leading lines, even down to the girl on the right pointing her finger towards the kid on the left, who's also catching back some line of sight from the child on the right. So to sum it up here and keep it under 30 minutes, we're doing pretty good. Movement is a principle of composition that guides the viewer's eye through a piece, creating a sense of energy, action, and dynamic flow using lines, shapes, and colors. We talked about physical, implied, rhythmic, and optical movement. Line of sight is the invisible straight path between a viewer's eye and a subject, or between figures within a composition. Action lines, also known as speed lines or even motion lines, abstract lines that appear behind the subject and suggest movement. And then leading lines are a powerful compositional technique in photography where natural or man-made lines guide the viewer's eye through an image. And that's what we have for this week. We have 6 of them down and 2 more to go. So I hope you're all keeping your notes or keeping some sort of documentation of all the previous ones as well as the ones that you're doing, because they do all tie in together. Thanks again, and I will talk to you again next week.